Get your hands where I can see them. The command came sharp and hostile, cutting through the warm afternoon air like a blade. Officer Dennis Keller stood with his hand already resting on his belt, fingers twitching near the grip of his weapon. His face was twisted into something between disgust and authority, the kind of expression that had been practiced over years of deciding who belonged and who didn't. He wasn't asking. He was demanding, and his eyes, cold and certain, were locked on the young black man in military fatigues standing 20 feet away near the commissary entrance. Terrence Hayes, 25, sergeant in the United States Army, stationed at Fort Mason just outside Richmond, Virginia, had been reaching into his pocket for his military ID. He froze mid-motion. His hand hovered in the air, visible, open, unthreatening, but Keller didn't see a soldier. He saw a threat. He saw a problem. He saw exactly what he'd been trained by his own biases to see. I said, "Hands up." Keller barked again, louder this time, taking 2 aggressive steps forward. His partner, Officer Greg Sullivan, a younger man with nervous eyes and a badge still shiny from lack of real experience, moved into position on the left flank. He didn't speak, but his body language screamed compliance with whatever Keller decided to do next. Terrence's voice came steady, controlled, the kind of calm that only came from discipline and experience. "I'm stationed here. I was just getting my ID. I'm Sergeant Terrence Hayes, 3rd Infantry Division. If you let me show you my credentials—" "I don't care what you say you are," Keller interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't look like you belong here. You look like someone trying to get into a place they have no business being in." Around them, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base. Soldiers moved in and out of the commissary, some pausing when they noticed the confrontation. A few slowed their steps. Others pulled out phones. The base wasn't large, but it was active, and word traveled fast. Already a small crowd was beginning to form at a distance, close enough to watch, far enough to stay out of the line of fire. Terrence hadn't done anything wrong. He had walked onto his own base after a 12-hour shift. He was exhausted, hungry, and just trying to grab a meal before heading back to the barracks. He had every right to be there. Every clearance, every credential. But none of that mattered to Dennis Keller, because Keller didn't see rank. He didn't see service. He saw skin. "Turn around," Keller ordered. "Hands behind your back, now." Terrence's jaw tightened. He had been in situations like this before. Not on base, but out in the world. Small towns, traffic stops, grocery stores where security followed him down every aisle. He knew the script. He knew the danger. And he knew that even though he wore the uniform of his country, it wouldn't protect him from a man who had already decided what he was. "Officer, I'm following your instructions," Terrence said, his voice still measured. "But I need you to understand that I am military personnel. This is my base. I have every right to be here. I'm not resisting. I'm complying. Just let me show you my ID." Keller moved faster than anyone expected. He closed the distance in 3 strides, grabbed Terrence by the arm, and wrenched it backward with unnecessary force. Terrence winced but didn't pull away. He kept his other hand visible, kept his breathing steady, kept doing everything he had been trained to do in situations where authority was abused. "You're resisting," Keller hissed into his ear. "I can feel it." "Don't make this worse for yourself," Sullivan finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Dennis, maybe we should just check his ID first." "He's in uniform. He might actually be—" "Stay out of this," Keller snapped without looking at his partner. "I know what I'm doing." The crowd had grown. A woman in civilian clothes, Rachel Kim, a logistics coordinator who worked on base, raised her phone and started recording. She didn't say anything, but her hands were shaking. Beside her, a soldier named Diego Martinez, still in his PT gear from morning drills, pulled out his phone too. He looked at Rachel and she looked back. Neither of them said a word, but the message was clear. "This needs to be seen." Keller yanked Terrence's other arm behind his back and forced him down onto his knees. The pavement was hot, rough, unforgiving. Terrence's knees hit hard, but he didn't cry out. He kept his face forward, kept his breathing controlled, kept his voice calm even as humiliation burned through him like acid. "Officer Keller, I am Sergeant Terrence Hayes. I am asking you respectfully to verify my identification before you escalate this situation any further." Keller leaned down close, his breath hot and sour. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to make demands. You're on the ground because that's where people like you end up when they don't listen. People like me. The words hung in the air like smoke. Terrence didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everyone watching knew exactly what Keller meant. Sullivan shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Dennis, seriously. Just let him show his ID. This is getting out of hand. Keller ignored him. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and snapped one cuff around Terrence's wrist with enough force to leave a red mark. Terrence didn't resist. He didn't pull. He didn't fight. But Keller treated him like he was. Stop resisting, Keller shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. It was a performance. A justification being built in real time. I'm not resisting, Terrence said quietly. I haven't moved. But Keller wasn't listening. He grabbed the back of Terrence's head and shoved it down toward the pavement. Terrence's forehead scraped against the rough surface and a thin line of blood appeared above his eyebrow. The crowd gasped. Rachel's phone stayed steady. Diego whispered into his camera. This is Sergeant Terrence Hayes. He's being assaulted by base police. He's done nothing wrong. From somewhere in the background, another voice called out. That's Hayes, I know him. He's 3rd Infantry. What the hell is going on? Keller's grip tightened. He wasn't stopping. If anything, the audience made him more aggressive. He needed to prove his authority. He needed to show that he was right, that he was in control, that he was the one with the power. Terrence closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his mother, LaToya Stevens, back in Atlanta. She had cried the day he enlisted. Not because she wasn't proud, but because she was terrified. She knew what the world did to black men, even ones in uniform, especially ones in uniform. She had made him promise to come home, to be careful, to survive. And here he was on his knees, bleeding on a military base at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect him. Keller pulled Terrence to his feet with a jerk, the second cuff still dangling open. He spun him around and slammed him against the side of a parked vehicle. Terrence's ribs hit the metal hard and the air rushed out of his lungs. He gasped, trying to breathe, trying to stay conscious, trying not to give Keller any excuse to escalate further. You think you're special? Keller sneered. You think that uniform makes you untouchable? You're nothing. You're just another thug trying to play dress-up. Sullivan finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. Dennis, stop. This is wrong. He's military. We need to verify before we do anything else. Keller turned on him, eyes blazing. You questioning me? Sullivan hesitated. Then he looked at Terrence, saw the blood on his face, saw the way he was struggling to breathe, and made a choice. Yes, I am. Keller's face went red. Then you can write the report explaining why you let a suspect go. He's not a suspect, Sullivan shot back, voice rising. He's a sergeant. Look at his uniform. Look at his insignia. This is his base. For the first time, Keller faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. He glanced down at Terrence's chest, at the patches, the name tape, the rank, and for one brief second doubt flickered across his face. But pride is a powerful thing, and Dennis Keller had built his entire career on never backing down, never admitting he was wrong, never showing weakness. So instead of stopping, instead of apologizing, instead of doing the right thing, he doubled down. I don't care what his uniform says, Keller spat. Anyone can steal a uniform. Anyone can fake credentials. Until I verify everything, he's a threat. Terrence finally spoke again, his voice hoarse from the pressure on his chest. My ID is in my right pocket. You can check it. Right now. Just reach in and check it. Keller stared at him. The crowd had grown to nearly 24 people. Phones were raised. Cameras were rolling. Voices were murmuring. And somewhere in the distance, footsteps were approaching. Fast. Keller reached into Terrence's pocket and pulled out a military ID card. He looked at it, flipped it over, read the name. Terrence Hayes, Sergeant 3rd Infantry Division, Fort Mason, Virginia. Active duty, current, valid, undeniable. Keller's face drained of color. But he didn't let go. He didn't apologize. He didn't unlock the cuffs. Instead, he shoved the ID into his own pocket and said, This could be fake. I'm taking you in for verification. Sullivan stared at him in disbelief. Dennis, that's insane. His ID is legitimate. You can see the holograms, the base seal, his photo. This is him. Keller grabbed Terrence by the arm again and started dragging him toward the patrol vehicle parked nearby. Terrence stumbled, his legs weak from being forced to kneel, his ribs aching from being slammed into the car. But he didn't fight. He didn't resist. He just let himself be pulled because fighting would only make it worse. Fighting would give Keller the excuse he was looking for. And that's when the crowd parted. That's when the murmurs turned into silence. That's when every phone turned toward the figure walking across the parking lot with slow, deliberate, furious steps, General Robert Hammond. 58. 2 stars on his shoulder, 3 decades of service etched into every line of his face. Stopped 10 feet away from Dennis Keller and said in a voice that could have cut through steel, "Release that soldier now." Keller froze. Sullivan stepped back immediately, relief flooding his face. The crowd didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Terrence, still in cuffs, still bleeding, looked up and met the general's eyes. And in that moment, everything changed. General Robert Hammond didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 32 years of commanding soldiers, leading battalions, and making decisions that determined whether people lived or died had given him a presence that required no amplification. When he spoke, people listened. When he walked into a room, attention snapped to him like a magnet. And when he gave an order, it was followed immediately, without question, without exception. But Officer Dennis Keller, blinded by arrogance and fueled by a lifetime of unchecked authority over people he deemed beneath him, hesitated. His hand was still gripping Terrence Hayes' arm. His other hand still rested near his belt. His face, red from exertion and anger, twisted into something uglier: confusion, defiance, pride. He looked at the general, then back at Terrence, then at the growing crowd of witnesses whose phones were now all pointed directly at him. "Sir," Keller said slowly, his voice laced with false respect, "this is a police matter. I'm handling a potential security threat. You'll need to step back." General Hammond didn't step back. He stepped forward. His boots hit the pavement with the kind of authority that came from decades of walking battlefields, briefing rooms, and halls of power. His uniform was immaculate, his posture impeccable, his eyes locked onto Keller like a missile finding its target. "That soldier," Hammond said, his voice low and controlled, "is Sergeant Terrence Hayes. He is a decorated member of the 3rd Infantry Division. He has served 2 tours overseas. He has earned 3 commendations for valor, and right now he is bleeding on my base because you decided he didn't belong here. So I'll ask you one more time. Release him now." Keller's grip loosened, but he didn't let go. His jaw tightened. "I was following protocol, sir." He matched the description of someone reported acting suspiciously near the commissary. "What description?" Hammond asked, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "Be specific," Keller faltered. "Male, mid-20s, dark clothing." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "Half the soldiers on this base are males in their mid-20s. A quarter of them are wearing dark clothing right now. So what made you single out Sergeant Hayes?" Keller opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but it wasn't one he could say out loud. Not here, not with this many witnesses, not with cameras rolling and a 2-star general staring him down like he was an enemy combatant. Sullivan, Keller's partner, finally found his voice. "Sir, I tried to tell him. I told him we should verify credentials first. He wouldn't listen." Hammond's gaze shifted to Sullivan for a brief moment, then back to Keller. "Uncuff him." Keller didn't move. "Sir, with all due respect." "There is no respect in what you've done here," Hammond interrupted. "You assaulted a United States soldier on a military installation without cause. You ignored your partner's advice. You refused to verify identification, and now you're refusing a direct order from a superior officer. So let me be absolutely clear. Uncuff Sergeant Hayes right now, or I will have you removed from this base in restraints." The crowd around them had swelled to over 30 people. Soldiers, civilians, base personnel, all watching, all recording, all bearing witness to a moment that would define careers, destroy reputations, and demand accountability. Keller's hand shook as he reached for his keys. He unlocked the cuffs with jerky, reluctant movements. The metal clicked open, and Terrence pulled his hands forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at Keller. He just stood there, breathing carefully, his ribs aching, his forehead still bleeding, his dignity bruised but not broken. Hammond stepped closer to Terrence. "Sergeant Hayes, are you injured?" Terrence straightened as much as his ribs would allow. "Minor injuries, sir. Nothing that requires immediate medical attention." Hammond's eyes flicked to the blood on Terrence's forehead, the red marks on his wrists, the way he was favoring his left side. "You'll be seen by medical personnel within the hour." That's an order. Yes, sir. Hammond turned back to Keller. His voice dropped to something colder. Officer Keller, you are to report to the base commander's office immediately. Your badge and weapon will be surrendered. You are suspended from duty pending a full investigation into this incident. Keller's face went pale. You can't do that. I'm civilian law enforcement. You don't have jurisdiction over me. Hammond's smile was thin and humorless. You're on a military base. I absolutely have jurisdiction. And if you'd like to test that, I'll have the MPs escort you off the premises in handcuffs. Your choice. Keller looked around wildly as if searching for support. Sullivan wouldn't meet his eyes. The crowd stared back at him with expressions ranging from disgust to satisfaction. He was alone, exposed, stripped of the power he had wielded so carelessly just moments ago. This is ridiculous, Keller muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I was doing my job. Your job, Hammond said, voice rising for the first time, is to protect the people on this base, not terrorize them, not humiliate them, not assault them because they don't look the way you think they should. Your job was to serve, and you failed. The words hit like a gavel. Final. Unappealable. Keller's shoulders sagged. He unclipped his badge with trembling fingers and handed it to Sullivan, who took it without a word. Then he removed his service weapon, checked it, and placed it in Sullivan's hands as well. You'll be hearing from my union, Keller said weakly. Good, Hammond replied. I look forward to it. Now leave my base. Keller walked away slowly, his steps heavy, his head down. The crowd parted for him, but no one spoke. No one offered sympathy. He had made his choices. Now he would live with the consequences. Sullivan stood frozen, still holding Keller's badge and weapon like they were contaminated. General Hammond turned to him. Officer Sullivan, you attempted to stop this. That will be noted in my report. However, you'll also need to provide a full statement about what occurred here. Yes, sir, Sullivan said quickly. I'll cooperate fully. Good, you're dismissed. Sullivan nodded and walked away, visibly relieved to be out of the spotlight. Hammond turned his attention back to Terrence, who was still standing at attention despite his injuries. At ease, Sergeant. Terrence relaxed slightly, but not much. Years of training didn't disappear just because the immediate threat had passed. Hammond studied him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I'm sorry this happened to you. On my base, under my command. This is unacceptable. Terrence met his eyes. Respectfully, sir, it's not your fault. It is, Hammond replied, because I'm responsible for everything that happens here. Every policy, every person, every failure. And this was a failure, a complete, inexcusable failure. He turned to address the crowd. All of you witnessed what happened here today. I want you to know that this incident will be investigated thoroughly. There will be accountability. There will be consequences. And there will be changes. What happened to Sergeant Hayes will not happen again. Not on my watch. The crowd murmured in agreement. Some nodded. Others began to lower their phones, satisfied that justice was being pursued. Rachel Kim, the logistics coordinator who had been filming from the start, stepped forward hesitantly. General Hammond, sir, I recorded the entire incident. If you need the footage for the investigation, I'm happy to provide it. Hammond nodded. Thank you. Please send it to the base commander's office. Your name? Rachel Kim, sir. Thank you, Ms. Kim. Your documentation may be critical to ensuring justice is served. Diego Martinez, the soldier who had also been filming, spoke up. I have footage too, sir. From a different angle. Send it as well, Hammond instructed. We'll need every perspective to build a complete picture. One by one, others in the crowd offered their recordings. Within minutes, General Hammond had collected the names and contact information of nearly a dozen witnesses. Each one would be interviewed. Each piece of footage would be reviewed. Every second of the incident would be documented, analyzed, and used to hold Dennis Keller accountable. Hammond turned back to Terrence. Sergeant Hayes, I'm assigning Lieutenant James Crawford to escort you to the medical center. After you've been cleared by the doctors, I want you to come to my office. We need to talk. Yes, sir. A young lieutenant emerged from the crowd, crisp and professional. Sergeant Hayes, if you'll come with me. Terrence hesitated, then looked at General Hammond one more time. Sir, permission to speak freely? Granted, Terrence took a breath. This wasn't the first time something like this has happened to me, and I doubt it'll be the last. But this is the first time someone with the power to do something about it actually stepped in. So thank you, sir. Hammond's expression softened just slightly. You don't need to thank me, Sergeant. You should never have been put in this position in the first place. Terrence nodded, then followed Lieutenant Crawford toward the medical center. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations buzzing with shock, anger, and relief. But General Hammond remained standing in the parking lot, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the base he commanded. He had spent 3 decades building his career, 3 decades leading soldiers, 3 decades believing in the values the military claimed to uphold: honor, integrity, respect. And in less than 15 minutes, he had watched those values crumble under the weight of one man's unchecked bigotry. But this wasn't just about Dennis Keller. Hammond knew that. This was about a system that had allowed Keller to operate unchecked, a culture that had tolerated bias as long as it stayed quiet, a structure that protected the wrong people and failed the right ones. General Hammond pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. "This is Hammond. I need an emergency meeting with the base commander, the provost marshal, and the head of civilian law enforcement. Immediately." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, it's late afternoon. Can this wait until—" "No," Hammond cut him off. "It cannot wait. We have a situation that requires immediate action. I'll be in the commander's office in 20 minutes. Have everyone there." He ended the call and looked back toward the commissary where Terrence Hayes had been just trying to get a meal, where a young black soldier had been treated like a criminal, where the uniform he wore meant nothing to a man who saw only skin color. General Robert Hammond had built his career on following orders, on respecting the chain of command, on maintaining discipline and structure, but he had also built it on protecting his soldiers. And today, he had failed one of them. He wouldn't fail again. Part 3, Dialogue Formatted. The medical center on Fort Mason was a modest building tucked behind the main administrative complex, painted in the same muted beige as every other structure on base. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Lieutenant James Crawford walked beside Terrence Hayes in silence, occasionally glancing over as if to make sure the sergeant was still upright. Terrence was upright but barely. His ribs throbbed with every breath. His wrists ached where the cuffs had dug into his skin, and the cut above his eyebrow, though shallow, stung with a persistent burn that reminded him of every second he had spent on his knees in that parking lot. They reached the intake desk, where a young medic named Brandon Cole sat typing on a computer. He looked up, saw Terrence's bloodied face, and immediately stood. "Sergeant Hayes, what happened?" Lieutenant Crawford stepped forward. "Officer-involved incident. General Hammond ordered a full medical evaluation." Brandon's eyes widened slightly. He didn't ask more questions. He just nodded and gestured toward an exam room. "Come with me, Sergeant." Terrence followed him into a small sterile room with an exam table, a rolling stool, and a counter lined with medical supplies. Brandon motioned for him to sit on the table, then pulled on a pair of gloves and grabbed a pen light. "I'm going to check you for a concussion first. Follow the light with your eyes, don't move your head." Terrence did as instructed, tracking the light left, right, up, down. His head pounded, but his vision stayed clear. "Good. Any nausea? Dizziness? Ringing in your ears?" "No." Brandon set the light aside and moved closer, gently probing the area around the cut on Terrence's forehead. "You're going to need a couple stitches. This might sting." He cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, applied a numbing agent, and threaded a needle. Terrence didn't flinch. He'd been through worse. Field injuries, training accidents. The pain was manageable. The humiliation wasn't. "So what really happened out there?" Brandon asked quietly as he worked. Terrence hesitated. Then he said, "I was profiled, stopped by base police, treated like a threat, because I didn't look the way they thought I should." Brandon paused mid-stitch, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was low and bitter. "Yeah, I know how that goes." Terrence glanced at him. Brandon was black too, younger, maybe 23. He finished the stitch in silence, tied it off, and applied a small bandage. "You're lucky the general showed up," Brandon finally said. "Most of the time, nobody does." Terrence nodded slowly. "I know." Brandon moved on to check Terrence's ribs, pressing gently along his side. Terrence winced when he hit a particularly tender spot. Bruised but not broken. "You'll be sore for a few days." Ice it when you can. Take ibuprofen if the pain gets bad, and if you start having trouble breathing, come back immediately. Understood. Brandon stepped back and pulled off his gloves. You're cleared medically. But Sergeant, if you need to talk to someone about what happened, there are resources. Mental health chaplain. Even just someone who'll listen. Terrence looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Thanks. Brandon opened the door and called out to Lieutenant Crawford, who had been waiting in the hallway. He's good to go. Crawford stepped inside. Sergeant Hayes, General Hammond is expecting you in his office. I'll take you there now. Terrence slid off the exam table, his body protesting the movement. He followed Crawford out of the medical center and into the fading afternoon light. The base was quieter now. Soldiers moved about their duties, unaware of what had happened just hours earlier. Or maybe they knew. Maybe word had already spread. Maybe every person they passed had already seen the videos. They walked across the quad toward the headquarters building, a 2-story structure with the American flag hanging motionless in the still air. Inside, the hallways were lined with framed photographs of past commanders, medals encased in glass, and plaques commemorating units and achievements. It was a place that demanded respect, a place built on tradition. But tradition, Terrence had learned, could be a double-edged sword. It could honor the best of what people were capable of, or it could excuse the worst. Crawford led him to the second floor and stopped outside a heavy wooden door with a brass plate that read, General Robert Hammond, Deputy Installation Commander. Crawford knocked twice. Enter. Crawford opened the door and stepped aside. Terrence walked in and immediately snapped to attention. General Hammond was seated behind a large desk, covered in neat stacks of paperwork, a computer monitor, and a framed photo of a woman and 2 teenage boys. He looked up, his expression unreadable. At ease, Sergeant Hayes. Take a seat. Terrence sat in one of the 2 chairs facing the desk. Crawford remained standing by the door. Hammond leaned back in his chair, studying Terrence for a moment. How are you feeling? Sore, sir. But I'll be fine. Good. Hammond's tone softened slightly. I've reviewed the witness statements and video footage from this afternoon. What happened to you was inexcusable, and I want you to know that I take full responsibility for allowing an environment where something like this could occur. Terrence didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. Hammond continued. Officer Dennis Keller has been suspended indefinitely. His actions are being reviewed by both military and civilian authorities. If the evidence supports it, and I believe it will, he'll face criminal charges. At a minimum, he'll never work on this base again. Terrence nodded slowly. Thank you, sir. Hammond held up a hand. Don't thank me yet. Because this goes deeper than one officer. This is about a culture, a system. And I need to know if you've experienced this kind of treatment before on this base. Terrence hesitated. He had, not as blatant, not as violent. But the looks, the extra scrutiny, the assumptions, they were always there, lurking beneath the surface. Yes, sir. Nothing like today. But yes, Hammond's jaw tightened. Tell me, Terrence took a breath. Last year I was stopped at the gate coming back from leave. The guard asked for my ID, which is standard. But then he asked where I was coming from, why I was on base, whether I had authorization. He ran my ID 3 times, made me wait in the security office for 20 minutes while he verified my credentials. Meanwhile, 3 other soldiers, all white, drove through without any questions. Hammond's expression darkened. Did you report it? No, sir. Why not? Because I knew what would happen. Terrence's voice was quiet but steady. I'd be labeled a troublemaker. Someone who plays the race card. Someone who can't handle the job. And nothing would change except how my command saw me. Hammond was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You're right. That's exactly what would have happened. And that's the problem. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base. When I joined the Army 32 years ago, I believed in something. I believed that the uniform made us equal, that our service mattered more than where we came from or what we looked like. And for the most part, that's been true. But not always, and not for everyone. He turned back to Terrence. I've commanded thousands of soldiers. Black, white, Latino, Asian, men, women, people from every background imaginable. And I've watched good people get overlooked. Talented people get passed over. Dedicated people get treated like they don't belong, and I didn't do enough to stop it. Sir, with respect, you can't fix everything. No, Hammond agreed. But I can fix this. Starting now. He returned to his desk and opened a folder. Inside were printed copies of the videos from that afternoon. Screenshots of Keller grabbing Terrence, forcing him to the ground, refusing to check his ID. Hammond spread them out like evidence at a trial. This is going public, Hammond said. Not because I want attention, but because people need to see what happens when accountability fails. They need to know that this behavior won't be tolerated. Not on my base. Not anywhere. Terrence looked at the images, seeing himself on his knees, seeing the blood on his face, seeing the moment his dignity was stripped away in front of dozens of people. It made his stomach turn. Sir, if this goes public, it'll follow me for the rest of my career. Hammond met his eyes. I know, and that's why I'm giving you a choice. If you want this handled quietly, I'll do everything in my power to make that happen. But if you're willing to let this story be told, it could change things. Not just here, everywhere. Terrence stared at the photos. He thought about every other soldier like him who had been stopped, questioned, doubted, humiliated. He thought about Brandon Cole in the medical center, who knew exactly what it felt like. He thought about his mother, who had begged him to stay safe. And then he thought about the kids who would join the army after him. The ones who deserved better. Tell the story, Terrence said quietly. Let people see it, Hammond nodded. Then we'll make sure it's told right. The story broke 3 days later, not through official military channels, but through the videos that had already been circulating online. Rachel Kim's footage appeared first on social media platforms, shared and reshared thousands of times within hours. Diego Martinez's video followed shortly after, uploaded to multiple sites with a simple caption, Sergeant Terrence Hayes, Fort Mason. This is what happens when bias wears a badge. By the time the sun rose on the fourth day, the incident had been picked up by national news outlets. Cable networks ran segments, newspapers published op-eds, activists organized protests outside Fort Mason's gates, and the Department of Defense found itself facing questions it had no good answers for. General Robert Hammond sat in his office, watching the coverage on a small television mounted in the corner. Beside him sat the base commander, Colonel Jeffrey Brennan, a stern man in his 50s with graying hair and a reputation for running a tight ship. Across from them sat the base's chief legal officer, Major Angela Reeves, a sharp woman with a law degree from Georgetown and a no-nonsense demeanor that had earned her respect across the installation. This is a nightmare, Brennan said, rubbing his temples. Every major outlet is covering it. The Secretary of Defense is asking for daily updates, and we've got protesters at the front gate demanding Keller's arrest. Good, Hammond replied evenly. Let them protest. Let the Secretary ask questions. This needed to happen. Brennan looked at him sharply. You wanted this? I wanted accountability. Hammond met his gaze without flinching. What happened to Sergeant Hayes was criminal, and if it takes public pressure to ensure justice is served, then so be it. Reeves leaned forward. General, I understand your position, but we need to be strategic about how we handle this. The media is painting the entire base as complicit. That's not fair to the thousands of soldiers and personnel who had nothing to do with what Keller did. Then we make it clear that this was an individual failure, Hammond said. But we also acknowledge that it was a failure we allowed to happen. Because if Keller felt comfortable acting that way, it's because he believed he could get away with it. Brennan sighed. The civilian police union is already threatening legal action. They're claiming Keller was following established protocol. Hammond's voice hardened. Then we destroy that argument with facts. We show that Keller ignored his partner's advice, that he refused to verify credentials, that he used excessive force on a cooperative subject. And we show that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Reeves nodded slowly. We've started pulling records. Complaints filed against Keller over the past 5 years. There are 7. 3 were dismissed without investigation. 2 were ruled unfounded, and 2 resulted in verbal warnings that were never documented in his official file. Hammond leaned forward. Who dismissed them? Reeves consulted her notes. The first 3 were dismissed by the civilian law enforcement supervisor at the time, Chief Harold Benson. He retired 18 months ago. The 2 ruled unfounded were investigated by Internal Affairs, but the reports cite lack of corroborating evidence despite witness statements. The verbal warnings were issued by Benson's replacement, Chief Patricia. She paused, checking her list again. Chief Ellen Novak, but there's no record of them in Keller's personnel file. So the system protected him, Hammond said flatly. Multiple times. It appears that way, yes, Reeves confirmed. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. If we release this information, it makes the entire civilian law enforcement division look incompetent. We'll lose trust with the personnel who work with them daily. Hammond's voice was ice. They should have lost that trust the moment they swept the first complaint under the rug. Trust isn't given because of a badge. It's earned. And they failed to earn it. He stood and walked to the window again, hands clasped behind his back. The protesters were visible from here, a growing crowd holding signs and chanting slogans that echoed faintly through the glass. Justice for Terrence Hayes, no more racist cops. Accountability now. What's the status of the criminal investigation? Hammond asked without turning around. Reeves flipped through her folder. The Richmond Police Department has taken over the case to avoid any appearance of bias. They've interviewed Sergeant Hayes, Officer Sullivan, and multiple witnesses. They've reviewed all available video footage. The district attorney's office is reviewing the evidence now. And, Reeves hesitated, off the record, I spoke with the assistant DA handling the case. She believes there's sufficient evidence to charge Keller with assault, battery, unlawful detention, and civil rights violations. But she's concerned about prosecution. Keller's union is already lining up character witnesses. They'll argue he was acting in good faith based on training and experience. Hammond turned around, his expression hard. Then we provide evidence that contradicts that narrative. We show that his training explicitly prohibits profiling. We show that his experience should have taught him to verify credentials before using force. We show that every decision he made that day was wrong. Colonel Brennan spoke up. General, I understand your anger, but we need to think about the bigger picture. If we come down too hard on Keller, we alienate every law enforcement officer on this base. They'll feel like we're throwing them under the bus to appease public opinion. Hammond's voice rose slightly. I'm not appeasing anyone. I'm holding a criminal accountable for assaulting one of my soldiers. If other officers feel alienated by that, then maybe they need to examine their own behavior. The room fell silent. Major Reeves cleared her throat. Sir, there's something else you should know. We've received over 200 emails and calls from current and former base personnel in the past 3 days. Most are supportive of your actions, but some are threatening. Threatening how? She pulled out several printed emails and laid them on the desk. These are a sample. They accuse you of race baiting, of destroying a good officer's career for political correctness, of betraying law enforcement. Some contain language I won't repeat. 3 have been flagged as potentially serious enough to warrant security review. Hammond picked up one of the emails and read it. His expression didn't change. Forward these to CID and make sure my security detail is aware. Already done, sir. Good. He set the email down. Anything else? Brennan spoke again, his tone more measured now. Sir, there's been a request from Sergeant Hayes. He wants to make a statement publicly. Hammond looked up sharply. When? Tomorrow. He wants to hold a press conference outside the base headquarters. His attorney has already reached out to coordinate with our public affairs office. Hammond considered this. Does he understand what he's inviting? The scrutiny? The attacks? According to his attorney, yes. He wants to speak not just for himself but for every service member who's experienced similar treatment. Hammond nodded slowly. Then we support him. Full resources, security, whatever he needs. Brennan looked concerned. Sir, if he says something that contradicts our official position... He won't, Hammond interrupted. Because our official position is the truth, and that's all he's planning to tell. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics, media strategy, and legal contingencies. By the time it ended, the sun had set, and the base had grown quiet. Hammond returned to his office alone and sat at his desk, staring at the photograph of his family. His wife, Sandra, his sons, Robert Jr. and Thomas. They had sacrificed so much for his career, moved across the country, changed schools, adapted to new communities, and they had done it without complaint because they believed in what he was doing. He picked up his phone and called home. Sandra answered on the second ring. Bobby, are you okay? I've been watching the news. I'm fine, he said, his voice softer than it had been all day. Just a long few days. What you did for that young man was right. You know that, don't you? Hammond closed his eyes. I hope so, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Then we'll get through it together. Like we always do. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. The boys' upcoming soccer games, a leaky faucet that needed fixing. Normal things. Things that reminded him why he did this job in the first place. To protect people. To serve something bigger than himself. To make sure the next generation inherited something better than what he'd been given. When he hung up, he pulled out a notepad and began writing. Not an official statement, not a speech. Just thoughts. Reflections on what had brought him to this moment. He thought about his own early years in the army, the times he'd witnessed injustice and said nothing, the times he'd looked the other way because it was easier, the times he'd told himself that change happened slowly and that his job was to follow orders, not question them. He thought about a young black lieutenant he'd served with in Desert Storm, Lieutenant Marcus Green, a brilliant tactician, a natural leader, someone who should have risen through the ranks to become a general himself. But Green had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Each time, the official reason was vague. Needs more experience. Not the right fit for command. Green had left the Army after his 3rd rejection, bitter and disillusioned. Hammond had never asked why Green was passed over. He'd never challenged the decisions. He'd just accepted them and moved on. And now, 25 years later, he wondered how many other Marcus Greens had been lost because people like him hadn't spoken up. Not anymore. He put down his pen and looked at the words he'd written. They weren't polished. They weren't perfect. But they were honest. And sometimes honesty was the only thing that mattered. The next morning, Fort Mason was transformed. News vans lined the perimeter. Reporters set up cameras and microphones. Protesters gathered peacefully, holding signs and chanting. And inside the base headquarters, Terrence Hayes sat in a small conference room, reviewing the statement he would deliver in less than an hour. His attorney, a sharp woman named Leslie Nguyen, sat across from him. She had taken his case pro bono after seeing the videos online. She was young, maybe 35, but she had a reputation for taking on civil rights cases that others wouldn't touch. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "We can handle everything through legal channels. You don't owe anyone a public statement." Terrence looked up from his notes. "Yes, I do. Why?" "Because if I stay silent, nothing changes. Keller gets fired, maybe prosecuted, and everyone moves on. But the system that protected him stays in place. The culture that allowed him to act that way stays in place. And the next time someone like me gets stopped, it happens all over again." Leslie studied him for a moment. "You're very brave." Terrence shook his head. "I'm not brave. I'm tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of wondering if today's the day I'll be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tired of watching people who look like me get treated like threats instead of citizens. If telling my story can change that even a little, then it's worth it." A knock at the door interrupted them. General Hammond entered, followed by Major Reeves. Hammond looked at Terrence, his expression serious but supportive. "Are you ready, Sergeant?" Terrence stood. "Yes, sir." "Then let's go." They walked together through the hallways of the headquarters building, out the main entrance and onto a small platform that had been set up for the press conference. Dozens of cameras were already rolling. Reporters shouted questions, protesters cheered, and Terrence Hayes, a 25-year-old soldier who had just wanted to get a meal 4 days ago, stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, took a breath, and began to speak. "My name is Terrence Hayes. I'm a sergeant in the United States Army stationed here at Fort Mason. 4 days ago, I was assaulted by Officer Dennis Keller while trying to enter the commissary on this base. I was stopped, questioned, handcuffed, and physically harmed despite providing no resistance and following every instruction given to me. I was treated like a criminal in the place I've served for the past 5 years. Not because I did anything wrong, but because Officer Keller saw me as a threat before he ever spoke a word to me." Terrence's voice was steady, clear, amplified by the microphone but powered by something deeper. The cameras captured every word. The crowd had gone silent. Even the protesters stopped chanting to listen. "I want to be very clear about something. This wasn't just about one officer having a bad day. This was about a system that allowed him to operate without accountability. A system that dismissed complaints. A system that ignored warning signs. A system that valued protecting its own more than protecting the people it was supposed to serve." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Officer Keller is not the only problem. He's a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem that exists not just on military bases but in every community across this country. We have given authority to people who abuse it. We have trusted institutions that fail us. And we have stayed silent for too long because speaking up comes with consequences. Behind him, General Hammond stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable but his presence undeniable. Major Reeves stood beside him, along with Colonel Brennan and several other senior officers. They were there to show support, to show that this wasn't just Terrence speaking. This was the command acknowledging failure and committing to change. I joined the Army because I believed in service. I believed in something bigger than myself. I believed that wearing this uniform meant something, and for the most part it does. I've served alongside some of the best people I've ever met, people who would give their lives for me without hesitation, people who see me as a brother, a fellow soldier, a friend. His voice grew stronger, but I've also served alongside people who see me differently, who question whether I belong, who assume the worst before giving me a chance to prove otherwise. And I've been told repeatedly to just deal with it, to keep my head down, to not make waves, to accept that this is just the way things are. He shook his head. I'm done accepting that. I'm done pretending that bias is just something I have to tolerate as the price of wearing this uniform. I'm done watching good people stay silent because they're afraid of retaliation, and I'm done allowing systems that claim to value honor and integrity to operate without either. A reporter in the front row raised a hand, but Terrence kept speaking. What happened to me was wrong, but I'm not the first person it's happened to, and unless we make real changes, I won't be the last. So I'm asking everyone watching this, everyone who has the power to make decisions, everyone who claims to care about justice, to do something. Don't just condemn Officer Keller. Condemn the system that protected him. Don't just express outrage, take action, change policies, hold people accountable, and create an environment where someone like me can walk onto a military base without fear of being treated like an enemy. He glanced back at General Hammond, who gave him a small nod. I want to thank General Hammond for his leadership, for standing up when it mattered, for refusing to let this be swept under the rug, and for showing me that there are still people in positions of power who care more about doing what's right than protecting what's comfortable. Terrence turned back to the crowd. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if Officer Keller will face justice. I don't know if the system will actually change. But I know this. I'm not going to be silent. I'm not going to disappear. And I'm not going to stop speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. He stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, chants of "Justice for Terrence" echoed across the base. Reporters shouted, questions all at once, their voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. But Terrence didn't answer them. He simply walked off the platform and back into the headquarters building, followed by his attorney and the senior officers. Inside, away from the cameras, Terrence finally allowed himself to exhale. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. He had just put himself out there in a way that couldn't be undone. The entire country had just heard his story, and now he would have to live with whatever came next. You did good, Leslie said quietly. General Hammond stepped forward. Sergeant Hayes, that took courage, real courage, and I want you to know that you have my full support moving forward. Thank you, sir. Hammond hesitated, then added, I also want you to know that this isn't over. The investigation is ongoing. The prosecution is building its case, and we're implementing reforms across the entire installation. Your voice will be part of that process, if you're willing. Terrence met his eyes. I'm willing. Good. Then let's get to work. Over the next several weeks, Fort Mason underwent a transformation. General Hammond ordered a complete review of all civilian law enforcement policies. Training programs were overhauled. Complaint procedures were revised to ensure transparency and accountability. And an independent oversight committee was established, made up of soldiers, civilians, and community members, to review any allegations of misconduct. Officer Dennis Keller was formally charged with assault, battery, unlawful detention, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. His trial was set for 6 months later. His union protested. His attorney held press conferences claiming his innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witness testimony, his own partner's statement. There was no defense that could overcome the truth. Officer Greg Sullivan, Keller's partner, was not charged criminally, but he was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. He cooperated fully with investigators, providing detailed accounts of Keller's behavior not just that day, but over the years they had worked together. Sullivan's testimony revealed a pattern of targeting black soldiers, Latino civilians, and anyone Keller deemed suspicious based on appearance alone. The revelations extended beyond Fort Mason. Other military installations began conducting their own reviews. The Department of Defense issued new directives on civil rights protections for service members, and Congress held hearings on law enforcement accountability on military bases. But the most significant change happened quietly, in the conversations between soldiers who had never felt safe enough to speak up before. Terrence became a symbol, not because he sought attention, but because he represented something people had been waiting for. Proof that speaking the truth could lead to real consequences. That justice, however imperfect, was still possible. One afternoon, about 2 months after the press conference, Terrence was walking across the quad when a young soldier approached him. He couldn't have been more than 19, fresh out of basic training, nervous and uncertain. "Sergeant Hayes," the young soldier said hesitantly. Terrence stopped. "That's me. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for speaking up." Terrence studied him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Private Isaiah Pierce, sir." Terrence smiled slightly. "Don't call me sir. I work for a living." Isaiah relaxed a little. "Sorry, Sergeant. What made you want to thank me, Isaiah?" The young soldier hesitated, then said quietly, "Because I've been stopped 3 times since I got here. Every time they ask me if I'm supposed to be on base. Every time they run my ID like it might be fake. And every time, I wonder if maybe I made a mistake enlisting." Terrence's expression softened. "You didn't make a mistake. The system did, and we're fixing it because of you. Not just me, because of everyone who refused to stay silent. Everyone who filmed what happened. Everyone who stood up when it mattered. Change doesn't happen because one person speaks. It happens because enough people finally listen." Isaiah nodded slowly. "I hope you're right." "I am." Terrence put a hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "And if you ever get stopped again, if anyone ever makes you feel like you don't belong here, you come find me. Understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." Isaiah walked away, a little taller than before, and Terrence stood there for a moment watching him go, thinking about all the Isaiah Pierces out there who just needed someone to show them they weren't alone. That evening, Terrence sat in his barracks room staring at his phone. Messages had been pouring in for weeks. Supporters, critics, media requests, hate mail. He had learned to filter most of it out, but one message caught his eye. It was from Brandon Cole, the medic who had treated him the day of the incident. The message was simple. "You changed something here. Thank you." Terrence typed back, "We all did." He set his phone down and looked around his small room. The narrow bed, the standard issue furniture, the American flag folded neatly on his desk. This was his life, his choice, his service. And despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and the humiliation and the anger, he didn't regret it. Because change was happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. And that was worth fighting for. The trial of Officer Dennis Keller began on a cold morning in late November. The Richmond courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and activists who had followed the case since the videos first went viral. Outside, protesters lined the steps, holding signs demanding justice. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, electric, charged with the weight of what this case represented. Terrence Hayes sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing his Army dress uniform. He had been subpoenaed to testify, but even if he hadn't been, he would have attended. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been treated the way he had been treated. Everyone who had been told their experience didn't matter. Everyone who had been silenced. Beside him sat his mother, Latoya Stevens. She had flown in from Atlanta the night before. She hadn't said much during the drive from the airport, just held his hand tightly and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." Now she sat with her back straight, her jaw set, watching the proceedings with the intensity of a woman who had spent her entire life fighting battles like this. On the other side of the courtroom sat Dennis Keller. He wore a dark suit and a neutral expression, but his hands were clasped tightly in front of him, and his leg bounced nervously under the table. His attorney, a well-dressed man named Richard Caldwell, sat beside him, reviewing notes and occasionally leaning over to whisper something Keller's way. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Evelyn Morris, was a black woman in her early 40s with a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and uncompromising. She had built her career on civil rights cases, and she had made it clear from the beginning that she intended to pursue this case to the fullest extent of the law. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The courtroom stood as Judge Barbara Henley entered. She was an older white woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation for running a no-nonsense courtroom, and she wasted no time getting started. "Be seated." She looked out over the packed courtroom. "This is the case of the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Dennis Keller. The defendant is charged with assault and battery, unlawful detention, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Is the Commonwealth ready to proceed?" Evelyn Morris stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Is the defense ready?" Richard Caldwell stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let's begin. Ms. Morris, your opening statement." Morris stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about abuse of power. It's about a man who was given authority and used it to harm an innocent person. On the afternoon in question, Sergeant Terrence Hayes, a decorated soldier in the United States Army, walked on to Fort Mason, the base where he is stationed, to get a meal. He was stopped by the defendant, Officer Dennis Keller, who immediately treated him with suspicion, hostility, and aggression. Despite providing his identification, despite following every instruction, despite offering no resistance whatsoever, Sergeant Hayes was handcuffed, thrown to the ground, and assaulted. Why? Because Officer Keller decided without any evidence that Sergeant Hayes didn't belong there. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The evidence will show that Officer Keller violated every protocol. He ignored his partner's advice. He refused to verify credentials. He used excessive force on a cooperative subject. And he did all of this because of one thing: the color of Sergeant Hayes' skin. This isn't speculation. This is documented, on video, in witness testimony, in Officer Keller's own words. By the end of this trial, you will have no doubt that the defendant is guilty of every charge brought against him, and you will have no choice but to hold him accountable. She returned to her seat. Judge Henley turned to the defense. "Mr. Caldwell, your opening statement." Caldwell stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, members of the jury, my client, Officer Dennis Keller, is a dedicated law enforcement professional with 15 years of service. On the day in question, he was responding to a report of suspicious activity near the commissary. He approached the individual, later identified as Sergeant Hayes, and followed standard protocol for securing a potential security threat. Was the situation tense? Yes. Did it escalate? Yes. But Officer Keller acted in good faith based on his training and experience to ensure the safety of everyone on that base." He gestured toward Keller, who sat stone-faced. "The prosecution wants you to believe this was about race, but the evidence will show that Officer Keller was simply doing his job. He had reason to be cautious. He had reason to investigate. And while the outcome was unfortunate, it does not constitute criminal behavior. We ask that you carefully consider all the evidence and recognize that split-second decisions made in high-pressure situations should not be judged through the lens of hindsight and bias." He sat down. Judge Henley nodded. "Ms. Morris, call your first witness." "The Commonwealth calls Sergeant Terrence Hayes." Terrence stood. His mother squeezed his hand one more time before letting go. He walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and took his seat. Evelyn Morris approached. "Sergeant Hayes, can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon of the incident?" Terrence took a breath and began. "I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I was tired, hungry, and I went to the commissary to get something to eat. As I approached the entrance, Officer Keller stopped me. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask if I needed help. He immediately demanded that I put my hands where he could see them. 'What did you do?' I complied. I raised my hands. I told him I was stationed on the base and that I had identification. I started to reach for my pocket to get my ID and he told me to stop moving. What happened next? He accused me of being suspicious. He said I didn't belong there. He refused to let me show him my credentials. When I tried to explain, he grabbed me, forced me to the ground, and handcuffed me. Did you resist? No, I followed every instruction. I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight back. I did everything I was trained to do in a situation where someone in authority is abusing their power. Caldwell stood. Objection, argumentative. Sustained, Judge Henley said. Sergeant Hayes, stick to what happened, not your interpretation of it. Terrence nodded. I was forced to the ground. Officer Keller pressed my head against the pavement. He took my ID and credit card and locked them in a safe. He refused to verify my credentials even after his partner suggested it. Morris held up a still image from one of the videos. Is this you in this photograph? Yes. Can you describe what's happening in this image? Terrence looked at the photo. His face was pressed against the ground. Blood was visible above his eyebrow. Keller's hand was on the back of his head. I'm being held down. My face was scraped against the pavement. I was bleeding. And, at this point, had you done anything to justify this treatment? No. Morris entered the photo into evidence and continued questioning Terrence for another 30 minutes, walking him through every detail of the encounter. When she finished, Caldwell stood for cross-examination. Sergeant Hayes, you said you were tired that day. Is that correct? Yes. Tired people sometimes act differently than they normally would. Were you irritable? Short-tempered? No. I was polite and cooperative. But you admit you were reaching into your pocket when Officer Keller told you to stop. I was reaching for my ID, which he had asked for. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Did he explicitly ask you to reach into your pocket? He asked for identification. That's where my identification was. So you made an assumption about what he wanted you to do. Terrence's voice stayed steady. I made a reasonable response to a request for identification. Caldwell pressed on, trying to paint Terrence as uncooperative, as having misunderstood instructions, as being partly responsible for the escalation. But Terrence didn't waver. He answered every question calmly, clearly, and with the kind of precision that came from military discipline. When the cross-examination ended, Terrence stepped down. As he walked back to his seat, his mother reached for his hand again. You did so good, baby, she whispered. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution called witness after witness. Rachel Kim testified about what she saw and filmed. Diego Martinez described Keller's aggression. Officer Greg Sullivan, Keller's former partner, testified about Keller's pattern of targeting people of color. Brandon Cole, the medic, described Terrence's injuries. And General Robert Hammond testified about the systemic failures that allowed Keller to operate unchecked. Each testimony built a picture of a man who had abused his authority repeatedly, who had been protected by a flawed system, and who had finally been caught because someone had the courage to speak up. The defense called its own witnesses. Keller's supervisor testified about his years of service. A use of force expert argued that Keller's actions were within acceptable parameters. Character witnesses described him as a dedicated officer who cared about safety. But the videos were undeniable. The witness testimony was consistent. And when Dennis Keller finally took the stand in his own defense, his story began to fall apart under cross-examination. Part 7. Officer Keller, Evelyn Morris began, her voice calm but sharp. You testified that you stopped Sergeant Hayes because you received a report of suspicious activity. Is that correct? Keller shifted in his seat. Yes. Can you describe this suspicious activity? Someone reported seeing an individual loitering near the commissary. Who made this report? I don't recall the specific name. It came through dispatch. Morris walked to her table and picked up a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the dispatch log from Fort Mason for the date and time in question. Proceed. She handed copies to the judge, the defense, and the jury. Officer Keller, this is the official dispatch log. Can you point to the entry that corresponds to the suspicious activity report you mentioned? Keller scanned the document, his face growing pale. It should be there. But it's not, is it? It might have been called in on a different channel. Officer Keller, there is no record of any suspicious activity report near the commissary that afternoon. So either the report doesn't exist, or you're lying. Which is it? Caldwell stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled, Judge Henley said. The witness will answer the question. Keller's jaw tightened. It's possible I misremembered the timing. Or it's possible there was no report at all, that you stopped Sergeant Hayes because you made a judgment based solely on his appearance. That's not true. Morris pulled out another document. This is your incident report from that day. In it, you state that Sergeant Hayes was acting suspiciously. Can you describe what suspicious behavior you observed? He was walking quickly, avoiding eye contact. So walking quickly and not looking at you is suspicious? In certain contexts, yes. What context? High traffic areas where security is a concern. The commissary is a high traffic area. Hundreds of soldiers use it every day. Do you stop everyone who walks quickly? No. So what made Sergeant Hayes different? Keller hesitated. He just stood out. How? He didn't fit the profile of typical commissary users. And what is that profile, Officer Keller? Keller realized his mistake too late. I mean, he was dressed casually, not in full uniform. Sergeant Hayes was wearing military fatigues. That is a uniform. He wasn't wearing a cover or a full-duty uniform. Morris stepped closer. So anyone not in full dress uniform is suspicious? No, that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? What specifically about Sergeant Hayes made you stop him, handcuff him, throw him to the ground, and refuse to verify his credentials even when your own partner suggested it? Keller's voice rose. I was doing my job. Your job is to assault innocent soldiers? Caldwell stood. Objection. Sustained. Ms. Morris, rephrase. Morris didn't miss a beat. Officer Keller, at any point during this encounter, did Sergeant Hayes threaten you? No. Did he raise his voice? No. Did he make any aggressive movements? He reached for his pocket. After you asked for identification? Yes, but I didn't know what he was reaching for. His partner, Officer Sullivan, testified that Sergeant Hayes clearly stated he was reaching for his ID. Did you hear him say that? I don't recall. You don't recall, or you chose to ignore it. Keller's face was red now. I was focused on securing the situation. By throwing an unarmed cooperative soldier to the ground? He could have had a weapon. Did you find a weapon? No. Did you find anything illegal? No. So an innocent man was assaulted, humiliated, and injured because you decided without evidence that he was a threat. Is that accurate? I was following my training. Your training tells you to ignore identification requests, to use force on cooperative subjects, to refuse your partner's advice? Keller didn't answer. Officer Keller, I'll ask you one more time. Why did you treat Sergeant Hayes the way you did? Because I thought he was a threat. Based on what? Keller's voice dropped. Based on my experience. Your experience profiling people based on race. That's not what I said. But it's what you did. Morris turned to the jury. No further questions. Caldwell tried to rehabilitate Keller on redirect, but the damage was done. The jury had seen him falter. They had heard him contradict himself. They had watched him struggle to justify actions that had no justification. When Keller stepped down, he looked smaller somehow. Diminished. The confident authority he had wielded so carelessly in that parking lot was gone, replaced by the reality of accountability. The defense rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next day. That night, Terrence sat in his hotel room with his mother. They had ordered room service, but neither of them had much appetite. LaToya watched her son, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he was carrying. How are you holding up? She asked gently. Terrence shrugged. I don't know. I just want it to be over. It will be. Soon. And then what? He looked at her. Even if he's convicted, even if justice is served, I still have to live with what happened. I still have to walk onto that base every day knowing that people saw me on my knees, saw me bleeding, saw me powerless. LaToya reached over and took his hand. Baby, they didn't see you powerless. They saw you survive. They saw you stand up afterward. They saw you speak truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. That's not powerless, that's strength. Terrence's eyes filled with tears. I'm so tired, Mama. I know. She pulled him into a hug. I know. They sat like that for a long time, mother and son drawing strength from each other the way they always had. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Evelyn Morris delivered her closing argument with passion and precision, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every contradiction in Keller's testimony. She ended with a simple, powerful statement. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. Sergeant Hayes deserves justice. Every service member who has ever been profiled deserves justice. And this community deserves to know that those who abuse their authority will be held accountable. The evidence is clear. The law is clear. Your duty is clear. Find Dennis Keller guilty. Caldwell's closing argument was more subdued. He asked the jury to consider the difficulty of law enforcement work, the split-second decisions officers had to make, the benefit of the doubt that should be extended to someone trying to do a hard job. But his words felt hollow in the face of the evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Henley asked. The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, guilty. A low gasp rippled through the courtroom. Keller's head dropped, his shoulders sinking as the words struck like hammer blows. Terrence exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. His mother gripped his hand tightly, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The judge thanked the jury for their service, then turned to Keller. A low gasp rippled through the courtroom. Keller's head dropped, his shoulders sinking as the words struck like hammer blows. Terrence exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. His mother gripped his hand tightly, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The judge thanked the jury for their service, then turned to Keller. Officer Dennis Keller, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. You are remanded to custody without bail. 2 deputies approached. Keller didn't resist as they placed handcuffs around his wrists, an irony not lost on anyone in the room. The same click of metal he had once used to humiliate now marked his own fall from power. As he was led away, Keller glanced briefly toward Terrence. It wasn't an apology, not really, more like confusion, disbelief that the world he thought he controlled had turned against him. Then he was gone, swallowed by the corridor and the waiting cameras outside. Judge Henley called for order. This courtroom stands adjourned. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. Reporters rushed out first, phones already up, microphones ready. Outside cheers erupted. Protesters chanted, "Justice for Hayes." News anchors interrupted programming with breaking coverage. For once, justice hadn't been delayed or denied. Inside, Terrence remained seated, frozen in the quiet aftermath. The sound of shuffling papers, murmured voices, footsteps all distant. He felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, grounding him. You did it, baby, she whispered. You stood tall. General Hammond stepped forward, his expression solemn. Sergeant Hayes, he said, offering his hand. You brought honor back to this base. Don't ever forget that. Terrence stood, shaking the general's hand firmly. Thank you, sir, for believing me. Hammond's eyes glimmered. No, son. Thank you for reminding us what belief really means. As they walked out into the cold November air, flashes from cameras burst like lightning. But for once, Terrence didn't flinch. The noise, the lights, the chaos, it wasn't intimidation anymore. It was proof that silence had finally been broken. In the days following the verdict, Fort Mason became a symbol. Not of disgrace, but of reckoning. Headlines blared across every outlet. Racist cop convicted for beating black soldier. Military base reforms after viral assault. Justice comes to Fort Mason. For the first time in his career, General Hammond wasn't just commanding troops, he was managing a movement. Congressional committees called him for testimony. Civil rights organizations invited him to speak. Even the Secretary of Defense issued a statement acknowledging, Systemic flaws in law enforcement oversight on military installations. Behind the cameras, change began to take root. Training modules were rewritten. New sensitivity programs were introduced, not the hollow kind filled with buzzwords, but mandatory sessions led by veterans and community advocates. Keller's conviction had shaken people in ways policy memos never could. Meanwhile, Sergeant Terrence Hayes tried to resume normal life. But normal had changed. Soldiers saluted him in hallways. Strangers mailed letters. Some thanked him. Others warned him to watch his back. Social media turned him into both hero and target. His inbox flooded daily job offers, interview requests, even hate mail printed in all caps and threats scribbled in shaky handwriting. He learned quickly that visibility was a double-edged sword. Late one evening, he sat alone in the mess hall. A few soldiers approached hesitantly. One of them, Private Megan Ellis, spoke up. "Sergeant Hayes, sir, sorry to bother you, but thank you. My brother's in the Navy. He saw your video. He said it gave him hope." Terrence smiled faintly. "Tell your brother to keep standing tall. That's what matters." They left and the silence returned. The hum of vending machines. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights. He realized how exhausted he still was, not just from the case, but from the constant vigilance that came with being seen. Across base, General Hammond faced his own battles. Internal memos leaked to the press, revealing years of ignored misconduct reports within the civilian police department. Senators demanded accountability. Former officers came forward, describing a culture of intimidation. Hammond read every report personally. Each one was another nail in a coffin built on complacency. During one late-night strategy session, Major Reeves looked up from her laptop. "Sir, you've started something bigger than this base." Hammond rubbed his temples. "That's what worries me. The bigger it gets, the harder it is to control." "Maybe control isn't the goal anymore," Reeves said quietly. "Maybe change is." He nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure it's real change." 2 weeks later, sentencing day arrived. The courthouse was full again. Keller entered in shackles, thinner, paler. His arrogance had evaporated. Judge Henley read the sentence: 8 years in federal prison with no eligibility for early release. The courtroom was silent. No cheers, no jeers, just the weight of consequence hanging in the air. Keller's attorney muttered about appeals, but everyone knew the verdict would stand. The evidence was too strong. The public too aware. The system, for once, unwilling to bend. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Terrence faced the reporters again. "I don't celebrate another man's downfall," he said. "But I do celebrate accountability, because without it, justice is just a word." The clip aired nationwide that night. It became the quote that defined the story. Months passed. Winter melted into spring, but the conversation never cooled. The Department of Defense launched Project Guardian, a nationwide initiative to reform civilian policing on all military bases. New oversight boards were created. Diversity recruitment soared, and Fort Mason, once infamous, became the model for reform. Terrence's life, however, was far from simple. He was promoted to staff sergeant, an honor that should have felt triumphant. Yet with it came scrutiny. Every decision he made was dissected, every commendation questioned. Some colleagues treated him like a celebrity. Others avoided him altogether, afraid association might be political. One night, Hammond invited Terrence to his home for dinner. Sandra Hammond cooked roast chicken and cornbread. The general poured sweet tea into tall glasses. "You ever think about commissioning?" Hammond asked mid-meal. Terrence smiled. "Not really. Feels like a whole different world." "It is," Hammond agreed, "and we need people like you in it. Officers who know what integrity looks like from both sides." Terrence looked thoughtful. "You think I could make that kind of difference?" "I don't think," Hammond said. "I know." In the months that followed, Terrence began mentoring younger soldiers. He led workshops on respectful policing and race relations within the ranks. His story became required viewing at training academies. Universities invited him to speak. He declined most, preferring small room conversations where real change happened face to face, soldier to soldier. Meanwhile, Keller's prison interviews began circulating online. He insisted he had been misunderstood, claiming media manipulation. But even among his former peers, sympathy was scarce. The footage of him pressing a soldier's face into pavement was burned into public memory. There was no rewriting that image. General Hammond retired 6 months later. His farewell ceremony was modest, but his legacy immense. In his final address, he said, "Leadership isn't about preserving systems. It's about dismantling the ones that fail the people they were built to serve." Afterward, he approached Terrence privately. "You ready to carry the torch?" Terrence nodded. "You already lit the fire, sir. I'll keep it burning." 2 years later, Fort Mason looked different now. Murals celebrating unity adorned the training center walls. Officers wore body cameras by regulation, and an annual symposium the Hayes Forum brought together military, police, and civil rights leaders to discuss accountability in uniformed service. Terrence Hayes, now Lieutenant Hayes, stood on the same platform where he'd once spoken as a victim. The crowd before him was larger, more diverse, and filled with young recruits who had grown up watching his story online. He began simply, "I used to think justice was a destination. Now I know it's a daily practice." The crowd listened, quiet and intent. "I still wear the scar above my eye," he continued. "Some days I wish it would fade. But then I remember it's not just a scar. It's a reminder. A reminder that silence protects the wrong people, that courage has a cost, and that systems don't change until people inside them do." Applause rose, long and sustained. Later that night, he sat outside his quarters, watching the sunset bleed gold across the Virginia horizon. His phone buzzed a message from Private Isaiah Pierce, now a corporal. "They just trained the new recruits on the Keller case. Told them it's proof the system works when people refuse to be silent." Terrence smiled. Maybe it finally does, he thought. In Atlanta, his mother watched her son's speech on television. Tears filled her eyes, not of worry this time, but of pride. She whispered to herself, "He came home." General Hammond, now retired and living in North Carolina, wrote a memoir titled Command Decisions. The opening chapter was dedicated to Terrence Hayes. It read simply, "To the soldier who taught me that courage doesn't always wear stripes, it sometimes wears scars." The world had changed incrementally but undeniably. And though there were still battles left to fight, one truth had been carved into the conscience of a nation. Justice isn't a headline. It's a promise. And sometimes keeping that promise begins with one man refusing to kneel quietly on the pavement.